Hello? should now like to call upon the auditor to introduce the invited guests to the House.
Hello again. So this is the part of the night where we actually have the debate. Our guests this evening we have 4. So we have 2 on proposition, 1 on opposition, and a guest chair. Our chair for the night is Professor John Fitzgerald. Professor Fitzgerald is the chair of Ireland's first National Expert Advisory Council on Climate Change, which was established to advise government departments and agencies on the actions required to decarbonise the Irish economy by 2050. He is a former research professor at the Economic and Social Research Institute and is a member of the Commission of the Central Bank of Ireland, who is delighted to have him. Our proposition guests for tonight are Sinead Mercier and Dr. Ciarán O'Carroll. Sinead Mercier is a consultant and researcher on just transition, climate change law and policy. She has previously worked as a primary researcher with the Irish Green Party, the Philip Lee Law Firm, Irish Congress of Trade Unions and Amnesty International. She has been involved in climate activism with the Dublin Eco-Feminists, Situ, Not Here, Not Anywhere and Young Friends of the Earth. Dr. O'Carroll is a spokesperson for Extinction Rebellion Ireland. He started his career as a scientist researching solutions to the climate crisis and has since worked for ActionAid and the NHS. He is an environmental and human rights activist and has worked in Ascar refugee camp, Palestine, and was recently arrested for taking part in the rebellion the East Rebellion in London in April 2019. We have 1 guest in opposition this evening. This is Professor Andrew Burke. Professor Burke is Dean of the Trinity Business School and Chair of Business Studies. He became a Fellow of Trinity College Dublin in 2016 and joined the Board of the University in 2018. He is the university's board member of the Audit Committee and is also a board member of the university's Innovation and Entrepreneurship Board. He is chairperson of the Centre for Research on Self-Employment, a London-based international think tank on freelancing. We have 1 or 2 other standing orders for tonight's debate, which is how you basically engage with speakers. Speeches will be 7 minutes in length for student speakers and slightly longer for guest speakers, about 10 minutes. The first minute of that and the last minute are what's called protected time. So you hear a bell at the end of the first minute, like this. The same again at the start of the last minute, and you hear 2 bells when the speech is over. Between the first 2 bells, you're allowed to ask questions or basically engage with the speakers. You can stand up and give what's called a POI, or a point of information, by saying, Mr. Madam Speaker, I would like to make a point on X thing. They can either then accept you or reject you, basically wave you down, but otherwise you can ask like a 15-second question or give some kind of comment to the debate. For people who it's their first time speaking in the chamber, they have what are called maidens' rights, so you can't offer them information. I think that is everything. Yes. You also have oratory returns. Some of you will know. These are small sheets of paper that list the speakers this evening and allow you to grade them on different scales. These are really important for the end of the year when we collect all of the oratory returns and award special prizes for public speaking. These are both in the form of medals and cash prizes, so there's an annual €200 prize for the best speaker in the chamber, and that's determined by who's going to get the oratory returns. So I would encourage you to fill them out at the end of the debate, not as you go along, and then hand them to a member of the committee as you leave. I believe that is everything. I will cede the floor back to the chair.
All right. The question before the House this evening is that this House believes that any solution to climate change must be socialist. And I should now like to call on Ellen McHugh to propose the motion to the House.
$24 million. The number of people displaced last year by weather and climate-related disasters. 16,306. The number of species now classified as endangered and facing extinction. 57. The number of countries on track to meet their emissions targets by 2030. And 11. The number of years we have to limit climate change to a warming of 1.5 degrees. We are facing a crisis the likes of which has not been witnessed on Earth before. Every day we hear reports of climbing temperatures, rising sea levels and destruction of habitats. Every hour and every minute, people's lives are changed by the destruction that the human race has wreaked upon the planet we call home. These statements are incontestable. Climate change is real and poses an existential threat to life on Earth as we know it. We are the last generation with the ability to minimise the effects of climate change on the planet. The last generation that can guarantee that there will be future generations. Things cannot continue as they are. Mass consumerism driven by commodity fetishisation under capitalism has plundered our natural resources and has pushed our planet to breaking point. The redirection of attention to the individual as opposed to the collective has blinded us to the interconnectedness and interdependence of all life on Earth. A solution to climate change requires a fundamental shift from thinking about individual benefit to taking collective action for the good of society as a whole. This can only be achieved using a socialist method. In this speech, I will illustrate why any so-called solution to climate change not founded on socialist principles is destined to fail by explaining the fatal flaws in potential capitalist or middle-of-the-road approaches. First, however, it is incumbent on me to provide some form of definition of socialism. Socialism is a contested and complex concept, with many different interpretations of it. However, there are a number of core principles inherent to socialism, namely collective ownership and distribution of resources by a central government. All conceptions of socialism are bound together by the idea of the collective as opposed to the individual, the society as a whole as opposed to single persons. And it is upon this idea that I would like to focus my argument, that this idea is essential to combating climate change and that it is unattainable in a capitalist or middle-of-the-road approach. To understand why this idea of the collective is essential to combating climate change, it is useful to juxtapose it with its antithesis, the emphasis on the individual as seen under capitalism. As any introduction to economics student will tell you, capitalism is an economic system where the main institutions are private property, markets and firms. Capitalist systems place a great emphasis on individual decision-making, both of consumers and of firms, and attempts to regulate either tend to be viewed negatively. This emphasis on the individual leads to the underlying pervasive principle of capitalism, greed. Under capitalism, people and firms are incentivised to cut corners to get ahead. Decisions are made by asking, what's in it for me? Under capitalism, we cannot have the true selfless cooperation necessary to combat climate change. This can be seen by setting up agreements on emission targets as a two-player economic game. Under capitalism, both parties are incentivised to ignore targets in favour of higher levels of production in an attempt to outdo the other party in economic performance. This leads to more negative outcomes in the long run, and in the case of climate change, these negative outcomes are catastrophic. Members of the opposition may ask why countries that have adopted socialism, such as China, are not particularly climate friendly. But in order for countries such as China to compete with capitalist economies, they are constantly forced to compromise on the socialist principles that I focused on in my speech. As long as countries are forced to operate in a global economy wherein the underlying mindset is that of a capitalist emphasis on the individual, we will never achieve true cooperation. It is clear that the variable that we need most urgently to change is the underlying principle upon which we base global economic and political decision-making. Without this change, a solution to climate change will not be found. And even if it were to be found, it would be impossible to ensure its implementation in a system that rewards those who double deal, cheat and lie, those who smile for photos at a climate conference and then grant permission for oil drilling, those who sign accords and then break their promises. If an attempt to solve climate change is made under the capitalist system of private property and extreme individualism, this attempt is doomed to fail. I want to briefly discuss the problem with middle-of-the-road approach to climate change, so I just spent way too long giving out about capitalism. And the difficulty that I have with the middle-of-the-road or compromise approach is that it gives too much room for countries and corporations to continue to operate under the status quo, under the guise of change. In a compromise situation, neither side achieves what they really want, which means cooperation is still unlikely and begrudging. In addition, the discussion surrounding potential actions would focus less on whether the action would be beneficial and more on whether it would be too capitalist or too socialist. The longer you sit on a fence, the sorer it gets, and in this case, the soreness is global catastrophe. The shortness of time we have to combat climate change means that we need radical change. It may be unpalatable to some, but frankly, I don't have much sympathy towards those who profit off the destruction of our planet. To conclude, we have seen how capitalism has warped our view of our place in the world. We have seen how it incentivises people and countries to disregard our obligations to our common home and to contribute further to the destruction of our planet. Under capitalism, short-term economic gain will always take priority over action for the good of the planet. The individual will always have precedence over the collective. If we are to find a solution to capitalism, to climate change, but also to capitalism, we must look to socialism. We must put aside our selfishness, our greed. We must, for the sake of future generations, prioritise the collective. Thank you.
In October 2018, the IPCC special report predicted with high certainty that we will reach warming of 1.5 degrees anytime between 11 and 21 years, prophesying widespread food and water instability, disease, and species collapse. We are atmospherically locked into climate instability for generations to come. And while we can't solve climate change and completely avoid it, systemic change is urgent and unavoidable. Now, I am not going to forfeit my hard-won tree-hugger credentials and suggest that business as usual capitalism is going to save us. In basing a global economy upon the cheapest and most politically viable form of energy, fossil fuels, capitalism spells trouble for the planet. But does that mean that the solution to climate change is socialism? In Ireland and abroad, we're increasingly comfortable thinking about socialism as the green bullet. Politicians in my country, such as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, have inspired the left and given aneurysms to the right in branding themselves as socialists out to save the planet. But the successful socialist systems that we see today aren't exactly sustainable oases. Norway and Bolivia have created fair societies for their citizens to regulate business and serve their people, yet their wealth to do so continues to be based on oil and gas and other fossil fuels. Humans may have caused this mess. We are also capable of imagining and enacting a mosaic of solutions to it, as states, as communities, online, in cities, and hamlets. For something that threatens our very existence, we cannot limit our scope to socialism alone. I'll first define socialism, discuss its inability to address global problems and a diversity of solutions, and show how socialism does not include the voices we need in this fight. But first, let's get a clear idea of socialism. Like my relationship with my high school boyfriend, we could spend months trying to define what it is. According to the International Encyclopedia of Political Science, socialism is an economic and political theory, quote, which advocates public ownership of the means of production and allocation of resources, unquote. Arnold Scott notes that, quote, to be a socialist is not just to believe in certain ends, it also requires a belief in certain institutional means to achieve those ends, unquote. But those institutional means of allocating resources to promote social equality range from Stalin's Russia to Bernie Sanders paying a bar tab. In most streams of successful socialism, however, the state is the initial instrument to manage and facilitate these economic and political relationships. And we're going to talk plenty tonight about what counts as socialist, but for now I'm going to use it to reference a system in which, with social equality as the goal, social problems are addressed and solved through the state, which acts for the human community. Now here is where we run into our first problem. How can state-based solutions fix problems that don't recognize borders? According to the UNFAO, Africa is losing 23 hectares of arable land a minute to desertification, which isn't accountable to District of Voters or to the International Court of Justice. This problem with borders isn't new. The socialist moment of the late 80s and 90s was crushed by increasing globalization because you can't have a nationally planned economy when economic relationships are spread all over the place. The proposition might rightly point out that some states are definitely more responsible than others for climate change, but that does not mean that the solutions should be confined to or within our own states. More importantly, state-focused solutions do not adequately address problems of climate justice, in which those who have contributed the least to climate change will be affected most by it. If environmental efforts are focused only within our own societies, we do nothing to repair the global economic inequalities that make poor regions more vulnerable to environmental scarcity and violence. Now, socialism may preach allying with the left governments and groups across the world to promote global social inequality, but how far does that alliance take us? Are states only empowered to promote social equality within their borders? Or are they justified in intervening in other countries in the name of social equality? Socialism does not provide clear methods to address such global border-defying processes. Now, this is still largely theoretical, and I don't want to be stuck swimming in abstract ideologies. The main point here is that there are many good solutions to climate change, and not all of them are socialist. The IPCC often emphasizes the importance of Indigenous knowledge in observing and adapting to climate change. Many scientists work with Indigenous peoples in understanding environmental change that modern technology can't track, such as changes in wind pattern or the quality of rainfall.
On that?
Go ahead.
Isn't it rampant capitalism that has greatly minimised the living space and the well-being of Indigenous communities, and therefore isn't capitalism more likely to harm Indigenous communities and made us less likely to be able to engage them and find solutions to climate change?
That's correct, and I don't dispute that. That's entirely correct, and I don't dispute that. However, the question being debated here is that any solution to climate change has to be socialist, and I'm suggesting that there are plenty of other viable options that aren't necessarily socialist, such as Indigenous communities which don't recognise a state for these kind of economic processes. But thank you for your point. Many scientists work with Indigenous peoples in understanding environmental change that modern technology can't track, and they should also show us that there are other forms of government besides centralised states that can feasibly address our new reality. For example, the Arctic Council links Indigenous peoples, scientists, politicians, and local governments in a climate consensus which emphasises local people engaging in common actions of observation, mitigation, and adaptation, and not just through top-down initiatives. Now, at the risk of excommunication from the arts bloc, we have to acknowledge that markets can also play a role in fighting climate change. Now, Karl Marx was obviously not a fan of capitalism, but he and his fellow socialists recognized that it was the most effective means of production in history. It has caused an incredible amount of suffering in the past, in the present, and well into the future. But at the same time, it has allowed us to lift millions of people out of poverty and allowed millions more to meet their material needs. With the right regulations, the right social restraints, and prioritizing non-material growth, capitalism as an economic mechanism and not as a social structure can help us produce enough to lessen the human cost of climate change and strengthen social equality. And these are just a range of options. These are just two of a range of options we can consider, but a solution doesn't have to be socialist in order to be equal, effective, and lasting. We need to think about socialism in any environmental discussion. Bottom-up solutions alone may not act fast enough, and social equality has to be at the forefront. I'm not convinced that social equality alone will solve these problems. Does this equality extend to the physical environment? Does it extend to future generations? Does social equality include other species or inanimate parts of our ecosystem? It does not have to be limited to the state or economic actors. Now, we have a contentious past with socialism, and capitalism hasn't been any better. But history cannot serve us as well when our understanding of the world as we know it is being dismantled. Climate change is the biggest problem we've had to face as a species, and we have to take tools from every box we've got in order to construct a new and fair reality. We cannot trap ourselves in old dichotomies and future of challenges we can't even fathom yet. We cannot limit ourselves to social solutions to climate change when we are already in the red. Thank you.
On the 17th of November 2018, people might have been very confused when they turned on the news and their TVs and radios, because across the channel in both London and Paris, they saw two very similar sights. In Paris, we saw, and across France, the Gilets jaunes take to the streets in defiance of Macron's tax laws to increase petrol levies. They wore fluorescent jackets, they blocked bridges, roads, disrupted business as usual. Meanwhile, in London, environmental protesters, Extinction Rebellion, wearing fluorescent jackets as well, took over 5 central bridges, disrupted streets, roads, and business as usual. What to make of two movements who seem to have opposing values taking to the street on the same day, at the same time, wearing the same colours? And the truth that linked our two movements is that the markets and our politics are failing us badly. They're placing the burden of the ecological and climate crisis on the most vulnerable. Of course, not just in the global north, but in the global south as well, where we've seen the worst hurricanes, the worst in living memory hit Mozambique, hit Africa, and of course hit the Bahamas this week. Social and economic justice are linked to ecological justice. We're in a hell of a mess that our politics and economics are failing to solve. The first thing we must do when we look for solutions is to look at the science. And this is something that when I turn on my TV, when I turn on my radio, I do not see scientists on TV talking about this crisis. They're not invited on before these debates happen. So let's look at the science just a little bit before we propose solutions. We have more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere at any point in the last 2.9 million years, bearing in mind that humans in their present form have existed as civilizations for the last 10,000. The last time there was this much CO2 in the atmosphere, there was palm trees in Antarctica. And we've emitted 60% of the carbon dioxide that we have produced in the last 30 years since we've known of the climate crisis and its impact. And CO2 doesn't just go away when you turn the taps off. It's going to stay in the atmosphere for up to 10,000 years, continuously warming us from this point forward. And we face the catastrophe of tipping points, the Amazon and the Arctic, self-reinforcing cycles whereby if you take the Arctic and the ice melts, the sea then absorbs the heat instead of being reflected back into space. And without humans doing anything, the planet gets warmer and warmer and warmer, the ice melts more and more. These are self-reinforcing cycles that even if we stopped all greenhouse gas emissions tomorrow, the Arctic would still rise between 5 and 9 degrees in temperature by the end of this century. And we face runaway climate change. Folks, we've hit the iceberg. We're not approaching the iceberg. It's not a question of turning the tiller to the left or the right. We've hit, and we're going down by the stern, fast. So the solutions must reflect that. We need zero emissions globally by 2025. 80% of emissions are from the fossil fuel industry. They need to be phased out fast, which will include a massive state-backed building of new solar, tidal, and wind generators. Huge emission cuts from the global elites will be required. End of flying, end of industrial farming. We need to have the deep adaptation method front of mind. We need to withdraw communities from coastlines. All coastal cities must be evacuated in the coming decades. That includes Dublin, Cork, and Galway. We need to ration our resources, rewild our nature, eat with the seasons, change our value systems away from continuous growth, from what is individualistic towards what is community-based. And we must give people the psychological support to face the impending disaster and changes that will be required. And finally, as a solution, we must reconcile ourselves with nature and with each other. The millions of climate migrants that we are going to see, even billions, we need not to be putting up walls. We need to be welcoming them. We need plans. We need to know where we're housing them. We need to make sure that they live with dignity and with opportunity with us. But how to implement such changes? Things that I have just proposed seem maybe extreme, not on people's radar, certainly not on political radars. I do not believe that this will be achieved by simply voting in a different party that will distribute wealth more fairly or pass more environmental laws on the left or the right. Fundamental change is almost impossible from the top down. It's coercive. It invites counter-reaction. It invites fascism. We need, though, to respect a basic logic. We will only get equal societies if there's equal access to resource and power. That means we need a totally new mechanism on how we govern our affairs. Is the solution to the climate crisis socialism? Yes, in that we need a system where resources must be regulated by the community as a whole. So what is that system that we need to replace our autocrats, communist congresses, and our parliaments with? Well, here in Ireland, we actually are one step ahead for once, believe it or not. And it is citizens' assemblies. Citizens' assemblies where power is devolved and their decisions are legally binding. But they need not just to exist in Ireland for one issue for a set amount of time. It needs to be all over the world permanently. This will give the power back to the people equally. And by them having the power, we have seen that they institute socialist resource-sharing measures and recommendations. We've seen this in Ireland, same-sex marriage, abortion, and even, yes, proven on climate change, where they proposed recommendations to the government that were far more progressive than the government would have ever come up with themselves or anyone thought they would. But, in conclusion, we need to practice it. You don't get revolutionary change by asking for it. You have to go out and do it. So everyone here who is listening, you know the truth and you know the science. So you have to act on it. To do our best is no longer good enough. We need to all seemingly do the impossible. We can no longer save the world by playing by the rules. We must break them. Everything needs to change in our politics and our economy. The way to do that is citizens' assemblies. Now is also the time to bring that about. We need civil disobedience. We need to demand it. We need to go out and do it. Now is the time for action. Now is the time for all of us to rebel. Thank you.
I am not here before you tonight to tell you socialism will never prevail, or that its end goal is not admirable, but rather now is not the right time, but we simply don't have the time. I'm going to begin rather optimistically by granting the proposition the benefit of the doubt. Let's suppose enacting socialism via democratic means is sufficient to tackle climate change, a respectable yet unfortunately unrealistic goal. I urge you all to take a step back from the proposition's idealistic vision and consider the current grim political climate. One only need glance at the news over the past 4 years to see that the political capital required simply isn't there. Despite my, and I'm sure many others, vigorous support for Bernie 2020, the reality is academics, socialist organisations and political commentators alike are united in discrediting his socialist self-identification, saying he simply doesn't meet the criteria of worker collectives and the death of free enterprise. Meanwhile, Brazil lurches further right and continues decimating the Amazon to expand farmland to feed its beef industry. Russia remains indifferent to its rising CO2 emissions, and the 5 billion people living in rapidly developing countries are beginning to demand the environmentally taxing luxuries of modern life we have all grown too accustomed to. So, how do we enact socialism rapidly and decisively in a manner that can wrest power from the corporations and halt climate change before it's too late? Revolution. To seize control of the means of production and distribution. Sounds familiar. Sounds like a dangerous path that has been walked and suffered through before. It is a path that, by its very nature, requires severe authoritarianism and social control to implement, that historically has been proven time and time again to stifle individual empowerment, innovation, and promote corruption, the exact antithesis of what is required to defeat climate change. Meanwhile, the echo chambers of university campuses and climate action groups may lead you to believe that the will is there to have a successful, broadly peaceful socialist revolution. One must ask, then what? Our green, or rather now red, island is fully devoted to tackling climate change, a drop in the ocean. Perhaps most of the Western world follows suit. Even the politically shattered United States miraculously pieces itself back together. Well, sadly for humankind, a socialist miracle won't save us. For the US alone to meet emissions goals, as per the Paris Accord, CO2 emissions would have to be cut to a level a third of what they are right now, the process beginning this very second. Hubris, I believe, is the word to best describe the belief that your particular political alignment is the sole solution, if there even is one, to an issue such as this. No. This is why climate change is an extraordinarily pervasive issue that threatens civilization as we know it in a manner more sinister than anything that has come before it. The danger it possesses spans generations, yet requires immediate action. Its effects are almost unperceivable in the short term, yet cataclysmic in the long term. The politicisation of climate change is in large part why the global response has been lethargic at best. The discourse has slipped out of the confines of facts to the realms of ideology and political alignment. The elected leaders of the previously mentioned countries can be quoted as downright denying global warming. To make climate change a socialist issue, as the proposition suggests, rather than a human issue, will surely be the final nail in the coffin, and do nothing but to divide and not unite. In fact, rather perplexingly for the proposition, this is explicitly stated by Extinction Rebellion, who are, and I quote from their website, beyond politics.
Point of information?
Time is running out. I'll take you at the end if I have enough time. We, as a species, have 10 short years to radically alter industry and economics globally. The most successful and influential ideological innovations of all, like the Enlightenment, the teachings of which much of tonight's debate relies on, took nearly a century to culminate in the revolutions that have shaped the world as we know it today. Perhaps we wasted our precious time thus far hoping for such an event, although it seems to me the proposition still has their fingers crossed. With new climate projections being ever more pessimistic, it is evident that our consumption has now outpaced our ability to reshape our core ideals. We must now start working with human nature rather than against it. Do I suggest we lay down as subjects to the captivating yet destructive forces of capitalism until the waters rise, the ice sheets melt, and ecosystems collapse? No. Although it is not on the opposition tonight to provide the magic bullet to roll back the clock on climate change, I would like to leave on at least a slightly optimistic tone. Unlike the proposition, who must insist that the institutions we've known and adapted to over the past 250 years being torn down successfully and rebuilt globally in a blink of an eye, I propose that the devil we know is better than the one we don't. We are the privileged few who are writing history not with what we say or what we believe, but how we act. We have the power to resist, the power to disobey without fearing subjugation, the luxury to vote with our wallets, and to educate ourselves and others in ways beyond the wildest dreams of our ancestors. The very apparatus that would seem to oppress us is in fact the best weapon we possess. It drives competition, innovation, and research at unprecedented rates. In the age of globalization, international trade, and markets whose influence, unlike political ideology, transcends borders and acts faster than the wildest dreams of any socialist demagogue. It is time to march not to change our governments, but to change the world. Oppose the motion. Thank you.
We have time this evening for 2 floor speeches. So these are speeches that are 4 minutes in length, given at the end of the debate. If you would like to give such a speech off the cuff, please write your name and the side you would like to speak on a piece of paper and hand it up to the front. So there will be 2 floor speeches at the end of the debate. Thank you.
All comments to name mercy are totally that.
Just point of information before I start, I no longer work with the Green Party, so I know I'm written down that on the piece, but thank you. Just to start off, so how bad exactly is climate change? You might be interested in the piece by David Wallace Wells, who began his article, The Uninhabitable Earth, by observing that global warming is worse, much worse than you think. Carbon has been added to the atmosphere 100 times faster than at any point in pre-industrial human history. And more damage has actually been done in the decades since the UN established the International Governmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, in 1988. More damage has been done since that, 1998, than the whole of human history up to that point. So, in the last 5 years also have been the hottest on record, and global CO2 emissions began rising again after 3 years of levelling off. The only reason why they did level off was because of the economic crisis. World energy consumption is projected to grow between 28% between 2015 and 2050, and these are not far-off dangers. Already countries like the Maldives are making decisions to move, and developing countries will bear an estimated 75 to 80% of the cost of climate change. However, how is capitalism dealing with this crisis? I'd like to tell you a little story about the history of capitalism and climate change. Firstly, the Industrial Revolution was not based on fossil fuels. The primary means of energy production after human and animal labour were wind and water. Water mills powered the growth of the cotton industry. However, in the book by Andreas Malm and other social historians like Stephanie Barker, sharing such resources required mill owners to work together to share water streams. It also required human labour that was in the countryside towns where people had their own means of subsistence and were loath to work in the darkness of a mill and would quickly collectivise as there was little competition for labour. To cope with this, companies needed another fuel, one that could be cut up, carted and stored away to suit the competition needs of owners, and also to areas where labour demand was strong. This led to the use of coal. Coal powered the Industrial Revolution at major human cost. Children, women and men worked in the mines, becoming stunted, blinded, crushed, blown up and crippled with injuries and black lung. What happened then? So why would we trust capitalism when its track record is so terrible? Fossil fuel companies are the main driver of climate change. In 2015, the fossil fuel industry and its products accounted for 91% of global industrial greenhouse emissions and 70% of all human-made emissions. The industry has actually known for decades for their responsibility for rising CO2 levels and the likelihood that the rise would lead to catastrophic climate change. From 1979 to 1983, the American Petroleum Institute ran a task force originally titled the CO2 and Climate Task Force. In one 1980 meeting, it said that it would start taking action on renewable energy and reducing emissions. However, the industry took no action to change its business model. From 1988 to 2015, they doubled their contribution to global warming, producing in 28 years the equivalent of their emissions in the prior 237 years since the Industrial Revolution. During that time, just 100 companies produced 71% of global greenhouse gas emissions. They also embarked on an ambitious campaign to lie to the public. In fact, when the Kyoto Protocol was opened for signature in the 1990s by the US, they wrote consistently to Clinton, telling him that they would be extremely harmful to the US economy, and took lead on a communications plan that would sponsor academics in Harvard and Yale universities and all universities all over the US and the European Union to promote climate denial. According to one count, the fossil fuel industry spent $370 million lobbying the US from 2000 to 2016. So what about the good capitalists? What about the green capitalists who are not involved in the fossil fuel industry? The assumption has always been that the market would pick up the gauntlet and take action where governments were weak, unambitious, populist and indecisive. The International Energy Agency and the International Renewable Agency state that we need investments in renewable energy to be double 2016 levels by 2030. They need to be $600 billion a year to keep below 1.C. That's 14 trillion investment in wind and solar combined by 2030. And is it happening? Much of the renewables boom that we've had in the last few years was driven by government subsidies. These are no longer there. These subsidies have ended, and particularly with the economic crisis, countries like Spain can no longer afford them, leading then to their governments being taken to investment dispute courts where the companies sue them for no longer providing subsidies. Investors are not picking up the slack. After nearly 2 decades of strong annual growth in renewables, everything is levelling out. Fossil fuel investments are still higher than renewables. Global investment in fossil fuels is $950 billion in 2013, more than double what it was in 2000, and more than 3 times the annual amount invested in renewables. The green capitalists are not coming. They're not saving us. They're not here. 1.1 trillion went to extracting fossil fuels in 2014. Even if we did have all these renewables, there's another question about that growth and where those renewables will come from and how will they be built. Once we trade fossil fuels for clean energy, there's no reason why we couldn't keep just expanding our economy and keep growth attached to our economy. However, one material, for example, that's needed to is neodymium. It requires sea mining, and it requires already mining across the globe is already resulting in massive displacement of Indigenous people, and already in the Sperrins at the Northern Irish border, we're already seeing people facing massive intimidation from gold mining companies. Indeed, efforts are being made by good capitalists to enter our environment into the frame of natural capital. We have our problem with our economy because we haven't sufficiently entered our seas or our air or all that is good about the world that we live in environmentally. It has not been entered into our global economy. Oh God, I just realised on the telly. Sorry. However, this is a reactive exercise. It's an exercise in damage limitation. It's aimed at protecting an economic system that was never set up to protect the environment, or indeed us. We need to look to other systems that do work and do have those organising principles at heart. It has already been outlined what socialism could be, or the many different variants that there are, so I'm not going to go over that. But there are other ways that we can do this. I'd also like to talk, just go back to a history lesson. So how do we get out of this point? Timothy Mitchell puts forward a very interesting theory on the origins of democracy. The history of Europe is that only you had landowners that sat at the table. Only they had access to democracy. However, Timothy Mitchell tracks how the coal miners... Timothy Mitchell puts together a very, very interesting thesis about how coal mining led to the concentration of workers in particular communities. And these workers then gained access not only to mining fossil fuels, which were then the basis of that economy, but they also gained access to the steel and iron that was then built from it, which built bridges and cities. And they also enabled the building of railways. So for the first time in human history, you had a working class, a working people, who before that were always dispersed across large tracts of land, and energy production had to be individualised. It was done by human or animal labour, but through the cutting down of trees. And now, for the first time, you had a working class who owned the conduits to which the international economy could operate based on fossil fuels. And they used these conduits to do strikes, to say that they weren't going to allow for coal to be shipped to certain cities or to certain power stations. And it led to the creation of a stronger democracy, because these voices led to a 7-day week. They led to voters' rights for working people, and they also led as well to better paying conditions, so women and children no longer had to work in dangerous mines. So my question is, how do we get out of this point? And I find it very interesting within the environmental movement as well, that there is, and even within this debate too, there's kind of this willingness to say that politics is the problem, democracy is the problem, it's populist, we shouldn't engage, we should look towards our markets and vote with our pockets. But voting with your pocket doesn't work. Unfortunately, 70% of the plastic that's produced in our food system has already been produced before it even gets to the shelf. Your pocket doesn't do anything. Whether you choose something else on that shelf, you're only reducing your emissions by 30%. It's deeply, deeply damaging as well for your own mental health and for social mental health to feel that disempowerment. So my question is, why not join a union? Why not say to yourselves, I find it so interesting that when it comes to this fear of socialism is so much based on this idea that it's autocratic, it's deeply damaging, it's undemocratic, it just seeks to control, it's dictatorships. Why do we accept dictatorships in our workplace and not in every other part of your life? When it comes to your private life, when it comes to your political system, you have freedom of choice, you have freedom of democracy. But when you enter the workplace, you have someone far wealthier than you that's building their house on higher ground, that's already asking tech workers, how do I control my security staff when climate change hits? These are all documented. These are things that the rich are actually already planning. And yet you listen to them and live your life as if you can have no democracy in your workplace. So that is one way to do things. I ask you, so The solution is solidarity, and it does not fall from the sky. It must be worked very hard for. Get involved in politics. Do not believe that the market will do it, because it will not, and it has not, and it never has. It never has our best interests at heart. What does is us and one another. So that's it.
Well, thank you, John, and thank you, Jack, for the invitation. I got the invitation yesterday, so I immediately assumed that there was some big speaker had pulled out at the last minute, and so I was actually, have to say, very relieved to realise that I come here and you're not disappointed that there isn't some other speaker waiting to take my place. Okay, so I think both sides of the House clearly agree we are in a pickle here, a challenge that really challenges the survival of the planet and the human race, and something that we need to take radical action. So one of the primary reasons that I'm against this motion is that it's starting by tying our hands. At a time like this, we have to keep all options on the table. Yeah, we have got to be agile. We've got to be flexible. We've got to be able to look at all possibilities. We need to change direction if necessary. And I think it is a mistake from the outset to lock ourselves into one single strategy. I also think against this motion because, frankly, I think it's a cop-out. Okay, I think it's a point-the-finger job. Yeah, it's not us, it's them. It's these bad people over here. It lets the people who are responsible for this off the hook. Yeah, and the people who are responsible for this are us. We collectively have got ourselves into this mess in the first place, and we collectively are going to have to get ourselves out of this mess. Not enough time. I need to get through here. And I also opposed a motion because I disagree with some of the analysis. Okay, I mean, it just for starters, just skates across some of the observable facts that we know about socialist economies. Okay, I'm not saying that social economies aren't capable of delivering a solution, but let's face it, folks. When you take a look around, for the biggest polluters on the planet, they're not capitalist countries; they are socialist. Well, no, I'm going to keep going here if you don't mind. You've got to find a speaker who can pick some of these up. But I mean, and the main polluters are the factors that determine pollution in countries is more about industrial structure and less about the political system. So if we divide up the economies into resource-based economies, efficiency-based economies, and innovation-based economies, regardless of their political system, you'll find that most of the polluters are in the resource-based, the agricultural, and in the efficiency-based, which are mainly the industrial. Okay? So it's a bit of a cop-out to point to a political system when really it's more about what those countries are producing. And therefore it leads us to the question of why they're producing what they are. And it comes back to us, is that if you look at the socialist countries and indeed the capitalist countries, they are both ultimately producing products that their consumers and societies want. Okay? And therefore, they sustain themselves. I mean, a leader, what defines a leader? What defines a leader are the followers. So no person is a leader without followers.
Point of information?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
Yes.
I've never done a debate before. Just how do you account for the lack of investment in energy efficiency then, or warmer homes? considering that it is desperately needed and desperately wanted by most people, but isn't actually being enacted?
I think that point is independent of the political system, and so I mean I don't dispute that as a challenge. And what I want to address is how we actually deal with that challenge. Okay, and I don't think there are any quick fixes. If you take a look at businesses, and you take a look at the causes of climate change, it's caused by a number of things. It's caused, first of all, by our capacity to eat meat. Okay, you know, companies produce the products, farms create the products, because there's a demand there. Okay, that's our problem. We've caused that. Those of us, I'm a meat eater, so it's caused by the pollution in the cars. It's caused by the short-termism in terms of the products. So I mean, if you our demand for fruit, exotic fruit that's shipped in from around the world, or demand for flowers, or demand for constant upgrades of electronic goods that causes products to be. I'm going to keep going here because I'm going to run out of time. These are all driven by consumer preferences, and companies wouldn't produce these if they didn't think people were latching on to these demands. Okay. Now I'll come to shaping those tastes in a moment. We add in air travel into that as well. So if you look at our behaviour, and I'm as guilty as anyone else in here, eating meat, using electricity that's produced by fossil fuel, driving a car that pollutes, doing endless air travel. Sorry, I'm going to keep going. Those are the things that are causing climate change. So what needs to change first and foremost are our consumption patterns. Yeah? There's no easy way out of this. We're going to have to take a reduction in our living standards to solve this problem. If we stop eating as much meat as before, reduce our meat intake, if we do less air travel, if we do some carbon offset on the air travel that we actually do, we change our consumer habits so that the superannuation of goods isn't as fast as before, then we will start to change the behaviour of organisations.
On that?
Yeah. No, I'm going to keep going actually, so I'm just going to let you know in advance. Yeah, let you know in advance. Yeah. And there's plenty of examples of where consumers have changed the preferences and they have changed the behaviour of companies. I'm old enough to remember when Oxfam launched Cafe Direct. And when they launched Cafe Direct, I wasn't even aware that there was an issue about the price that primary growers of coffee and tea were getting for their product. I wasn't even aware that that was an issue. By selling the tea and coffee, they created an awareness. And gradually, consumers came around to the point of view that, look, if I want to drink a cup of coffee or drink a cup of tea, I want to be sure that the person who grew the beans or grew the leaves actually was paid properly in the first place. And over time, the mainstream tea and coffee producers realised they couldn't sell any products unless it was fair trade. It's that level of change that we need to instill. So first and foremost, we need to change our behaviour. Right? It's not the political system, it's us. We're in this together, we need to get out of it together. If we start to change our behaviour, we will make it easier for organisations to make the right decisions. Whether they're in a socialist system, as they were in East Germany producing the high pollution cars in the past, or whether in a capitalist system in the current United Germany. Doesn't make any difference. We will help make organisations to take the right decisions. We will make it easier for governments to make the right decisions. We had Pascal O'Donoghue in here at a business school event a year ago where he was tackled about climate change, and his answer was, that the government had taken such a pasting on the water charges that they were actually felt that if they brought forward carbon taxes that they would actually be, the government would collapse. We collectively need to give any type of government the confidence to take the right decisions. Start putting in the regulations, start introducing carbon taxes, to ring-fence some of that money so it can be put elsewhere. We need to provide that platform. And then we need to start influencing and show some leadership. So, for example, we need to look at our own organisation. We're all part of Trinity College Dublin. We need to start here, okay? We should demand that the university is carbon neutral, yeah? Particularly in relation to flights. It will cost a bit, but it's doable. We should push for an agenda where the food in the restaurants here is by default vegan and vegetarian. So one of the things we're doing in the business school is we are introducing these changes. So that when people come on an executive education program at the school, the menu will be automatically vegetarian and vegan. If they want meat, they will have to opt in, just as at the moment you nearly have to opt in to ask for a vegetarian. That is going to start changing the minds and perceptions of individuals. So, in conclusion, I think there's no easy fix here. It is going to hurt to get to the right outcome. It is possible to do this. It is possible to get the agricultural production of meat down through our change in consumption, which is about 1/3 of the problem. It is possible to adopt the technologies, switch our usage of cars and so on. And on the energy production, finally, with biomethane gas and carbon capture, it is possible to reduce the energy. It will cost more. And the best way that we can help both the political and the business community is by changing our own behaviour first and then pushing organisations to make the right changes. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. I would like to call Patricia Strudzinska, who is a maiden speaker, and you have the right not to receive points of information from the audience. Would you like to keep these rights or waive them through Thomas Rapture?
I'll waive them, yeah.
Just before we begin, Patricia, a note on the floor speeches. We have one floor speech from the proposition, which will be given by Jack Kennedy. If you would like to give a floor speech on opposition, please send your name forward.
Okay. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, Chairperson, members of the opposition, members of committee. My name is Patricia, and today I'll be proposing the motion that any solution to climate change must be socialist. 415 parts per million. That is the number I would like you all to remember throughout my speech. You may ask yourself, why is this a vital information factor? You may think to yourself, I'm no scientist and do not care about statistical data. This year, the Mauna Loa battery in Hawaii has recorded 415 parts per million emissions of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. Yes, we have accomplished this together as a humanity in this developed world. We have reached our highest ever carbon dioxide emission levels, coming back to prehistoric levels when our atmospheric conditions looked very different to what they are today. The last time that we had this much carbon dioxide in the Earth's atmosphere, modern humans did not exist. Megatooth sharks prowled the oceans. The world's seas were up to 30 metres higher than they are today, and the global surface temperature was 5.6 degrees Celsius warmer than it is now. 415 parts per million. It may just be a number preached by scientists like myself to spread some chaos, to hit the breaking news. However, behind this number hides an ugly truth of our entire population. And here I bring in the political aspect of my speech. Yes, the population. As the Oxford Dictionary states, socialism is a political and economic theory of social organisation which advocates that the means of production, distribution and exchange should be owned or regulated by the community as a whole. Yes, indeed, political initiatives, taxation of companies emitting the greatest amounts of carbon dioxide levels should be restricted, but I believe that it is up to each and every one of us to aid in that matter. We can only overcome the poison that harms this world by standing up against it together as a community. We can speak of political leaders who hold the most power in the world, but it is good to blame others, to divert the blame from ourselves, not to find a fault in us, and say that it is them. It is like the Brazilian president because he has spoken strongly on his views of not believing that climate change is a real issue. And if we just persuaded him and made him believe that this world would be a better place. This way of thinking may only bring about its pure ignorance, because it's all up to us together. Yes, me and you and each one of us to make that change. And if you don't believe me, that a group or a whole nation of us can make a difference, then I assume that I also believe in democracy. If you ask of any examples from me, then what about the marriage referendum or the equal rights of women in Ireland? It was with the voice of the people that brought about all these political changes in our country. I may not greatly educate on economics, however I know that demand drives the market. If we demand for cattle, we won't have our deforestation problems, which are hitting the biggest news lines at the current moment. Animal agriculture is responsible for up to 91% of Amazon deforestation. Mass areas of the Amazon are cleared, set alight, and destroyed by farmers to make way for cattle grazing. Here today, I would like to touch upon some of these solutions to climate change. As recently in the news, we've been hearing all about the awful predictions of what may happen, but we have been not given any guidance on the resultant. So here it is. Number one, and actually the only key solution that should drive us is the use of less energy in any aspect of life in any way we can. We should not fall back on the aspect of renewable energy, saving our day-to-day. Recycling, for one. If everyone in the world recycled, there will likely not be as great a collection of plastic floating in the ocean between Japan and the west coast of North America, known as the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, which is mostly made up of microplastics. By recycling, we would reduce, for example, if a family of 4 recycled plastic waste, it would eliminate nearly 340 pounds of carbon equivalent emissions each year. Cut on your beef consumption, which is driving the market of capitalism. If you feel like you can't cut it fully, at least try to consume less than you already. If you don't care about the burning biodiversity in Amazon, maybe at least as a human you will think of all the remote village inhabitants by the indigenous people who mostly have no clue of the damage we in our political system have caused in their life and their habitat. Plant trees. Find the nearest area in your locality and plant some trees. Yes, we can't deny that the climate conferences in which all the nation's great leaders meet and talk over what must be done to lower CO2 levels are vital. We need to put out laws and direct the political governance to look at the serious issues of casualties of climate change, which are the planet as a whole. The meetings have mostly concentrated in the less developed countries who have little involvement in our 450 parts per million carbon dioxide emissions. They are the victims of our overusement. However, what good have they done to us far? The little islands of Kiribati are still under great dangers of fully disappearing within the next couple of years. Kiribati is a tiny country in the Pacific, which is just one of many islands and places in the world which are sinking at the moment. This summer, I was a research assistant in the most remote regions of the Amazon jungles in Peru. I had the pleasure of living amongst the locals, with their simple yet happy way of life, which they had grown up and only ever knew. They lived in small wooden huts that they had built themselves from the resources the forest gave them. They only had the scarce amounts of electricity from solar panels that we had brought with us to their tiny communities. Their choice of food lay rather with what they could hunt or gather. They lived simple, happy lives with little use of electricity. I am not calling for us to completely cut off our electricity and live through the Stone Ages again. However, there may be a thing or two that we could learn from them. We could learn how to adapt to the environment we live in for one. We could all individually take a minute of our life to stop and think over how we're living. Is there any way we could improve on it? And I will tell you there is many ways we could improve. But my question for you today is this. When will we reach the breaking point that we can no longer accommodate for this rush of constant growth? And will it be too late for us when we realise that point? I would like to ask you to consider my points before I have spoken to you today and propose the motion that any solution to climate change must in fact be socialist.
I'd like to call Sean Gordon-Dodge to speak against the motion.
I'd first like to thank the House for the opportunity to speak, and I love the vegan suggestions, Andrew. As a hippie vegan myself, this is a cause very close to my heart. Now, I had considered coming in pretending to be a young Joseph Stalin for this debate. You may see some resemblance. And I would have told you that socialism may not have the answers to climate change, but we do have the solutions, like vodka. Vodka is the solution. Now, we are at a crossroads, ladies and gentlemen. We can take the path towards a cleaner, greener, safer planet for all, or we can continue to hurtle down the path of dangerous fracking, unchecked carbon emissions, melting ice caps, spontaneous wildfires, and road tornadoes. And to make matters worse, instead of taking the path to climate justice, we have stalled the car between the two diverging paths ahead of us. And that is because of the backseat driver that is this kind of debate. By politicising the issue of keeping our species, and indeed just about every other species on this planet, alive, we are driving a wedge between potential partnerships across the political spectrum to help work together to save us all from catastrophe. No thanks. The socialist agenda is best articulated in the phrase, system change, not climate change. From the Irish perspective, this is indicative of Solidarity, Sinn Féin and People Before Profit's hijacking of the issue as a means to an end. That end being a socialist restructuring of society. Now, I'm not saying, no thank you, that socialists are not sympathetic to the green agenda. What I am saying is that they are prioritising their anti-establishment goals above tackling climate change. This is dangerous for several reasons. Firstly, it gives right-wing parties the opportunity to avoid climate change as an issue. Secondly, it alienates potential allies in the fight for climate justice. For example, a majority of young Republicans in the USA, despite being very conservative, do have real fears about the environment. We must, no thank you, reach across the political divide and work together to steer away from the precipice we teeter so desperately over. Because, ladies and gentlemen, despite the fact that I identify as a social democrat, I don't give a fig how much I am taxed, how much I pay for healthcare, or indeed how much of a problem classes imposes to the ideal of a fairer society if there is no planet left to live on. Regardless of whether or not we believe rich people should pay more tax, or that third-level education should be free, or indeed, on the reverse, that taxes and government spending should be slashed, we are all human beings. We are all stuck on this planet together. We are all, despite the fact that we may not like it, a family. No thank you. And just like we don't choose our family, but must put aside our differences in the knowledge that we are fundamentally connected and looking out for each other's best interests, we must also do that as a wider human collective. Ladies and gentlemen, I take issue with the fact that this motion suggests there is indeed a single solution to climate change. Anyone who spares half a thought to so complicated an issue would know that there is in fact a multifaceted collection of responses required to spearhead the assault against global warming. As our esteemed debates convener often says, and I'm sure he won't mind my stealing this from him, we need to be playing 4D chess, not checkers. This is why it proves disastrous to the collective efforts to stymie climate change when parties like PBP and Sinn Féin block legislation like the carbon tax bill in the name of protecting people from lower income backgrounds. Well, no thank you. I'm someone from that background. I wouldn't be in college if not for things like Susie and working 84 hours a week during my holidays, which I've been told is illegal, but I need the money. So I have a news flash for those parties. You're not protecting me, or others like me. You're endangering my life, the lives of my friends and family, and the potential children and grandchildren I may one day have. God bless. I say again, being alive matters more than my money. Once we've halted the effects of global warming and created a safer environment for future generations, then we can have the debate about income equality and breaking down class barriers. Not even the Green Party in Ireland are socialists. If you don't believe me, ask Tate Donnelly. He's here somewhere. Sorry, Tate. We don't need socialism right now. What we need is effective communication and evidence-based policy. And the evidence suggests that green energy is not only cleaner, but on a wider scale would be more cost-effective. Now, I 100% agree, no thank you, that capitalism deserves a huge portion of the blame for causing this mess. And I share the sentiments of the proposition that corporate greed is standing in the way of progress. But rather than waste the next 11 years on a pointless and time-wasting global revolution, let us use the greed of capitalists against them. What the proposition fails to recognise is economic liberalism's ability to reform itself and address its internal problems through market manipulation. That is not to say the track record of economic liberalism in the recent years has not been dismal, But despite what Ellen said, the biggest enemy of liberalism is the same as socialism. Good old-fashioned greed. Greed is our enemy. Therefore, this is the path we must take. We must make it not only more lucrative to switch to a green economy, we must communicate this fact to business conglomerates, multinational corporations and consumers the world over. We must change our behaviour. To put my own slant on the popular turn of phrase, if you can't beat them, make them join you. It is market demands that led to the creation of a Canadian company which sucks carbon out of the atmosphere at $100 per tonne. This kind of practice needs to be encouraged by the state through grants and tax breaks, not socialism. Again, we don't need socialism, no thank you. We need an aggressive restructuring of the tax system so that people with higher carbon outputs are taxed more and those who produce less are taxed less. This would move beyond the green agenda. Solar panel fields in the Mediterranean and Africa would not only contribute to a greener economy, but also gives opportunities to those countries to create lucrative industries that will help them pull themselves out of poverty. With windmills in Northern Europe and hydroelectric power in coastal countries, we can fuel a cleaner Europe. It's happening already. In February of 2016, Portugal produced 95% of its energy requirements through sustainable energy. Iceland produces 100% of its energy from renewable resources. In fact, it is energy to spare. What we need is a pan-European system of power stations and cables that transport clean energy as needed, not socialism. This is about expediency, not ideology. Practice, not promises. And why not try this one for size? Eat less steak! Do you know that one of the biggest contributors to climate change is beef production? What comes right after that? The dairy industry. Now, I'm not telling you to go cold turkey. Hell, you can still eat your turkey, your chicken and your eggs, although it would be better if you didn't. If you really want to help the environment, don't waste the precious time we have left on a global socialist revolution when every minute a football field-sized portion of the Amazon is cleared to cut lumber and to raise cattle. I've seen your social media posts demanding that Jair Bolsonaro ends the burning of the Amazon. Well, don't just post. Act! Thank you. After that, we can work towards a fairer society, and I will work with you to get there. Thus ends my vegan propaganda and my speech.
We have for the proposition Jack Kennedy.
They finally let me speak. So I don't have much time, so I'm going to get right into it. I won't waste much time on rebuttal, but I do think it's probably important to note, and I can't believe I'm the first person to mention this as the last speaker, that anyone who thinks that China is a socialist country is not qualified to speak in this debate. I know they call themselves communist, but North Korea calls itself democratic, and we don't believe that. So two things I think are important to note that are inherent to capitalism that are inherently fueling climate change. The first one is growth. That capitalism is inherently, like that's what capitalism means, based on investor ownership of economic things, right? It's that like capitalists, the people who own capital, they invested in things and they expect a return. And they, in order to get that return, they expect economic growth. They expect the economy to continue to grow, to continue to increase its output year on year. The thing about this is there are two ways you can achieve that growth. First of all, you can have the kind of on-paper growth that Ireland got when our GDP mysteriously jumped by 25% in 1 year because someone leased a bunch of aircraft out of a company, a shell corporation that was based in Ireland. Obviously, that kind of growth is kind of, if anything, a demonstration of the inherent ridiculousness of capitalism. That's probably not what people talk about when they say we want economic growth. The alternative then, the real economic growth, means an increase in consumption, an increase in production. It means producing more stuff, using more energy, using more resources, pulling more stuff out of the ground, and increasing the amount of actual economic activity that happens. A system which demands the constant increase in the amount that we consume and the amount that we do and the amount of production that happens is always going to use more resources, is always going to increase the impact that we have on the planet. It is a system fueled by greed, and if we do nothing, that greed will consume the planet's resources and it will ultimately consume and doom us all. The second thing about capitalism, something that again is inherent to capitalism, it's not something you reform out of capitalism, it's something that is built into the system, is stratification. It is necessary in capitalism. You can't have equality under capitalism because there has to be someone who owns the capital and therefore like owns the company and gets the profits for it, and there has to be someone who works for the company and earns a wage from that. Capitalism it's just not possible for everyone to own a Fortune 500 company. So stratification, some sort of economic stratification, is necessary under capitalism. I'd say two things on this, and the first one's kind of small. First of all, I just think that's fucked up. Like, I think even if it's not true that this is the only way to solve climate change, I just think it is fundamentally wrong, and I think that even if there are other ways to solve climate change, we should probably tear it down anyway. But it probably is still true that it's the only way to solve climate change, because, like, at the end of the day, like, there exist people who own shares in ExxonMobil, there exist moneyed interests, there exist people who have massive economic incentive for the current system to continue to sustain itself. There are people who own fossil fuel companies, who own the like 100 or so companies that contribute 71% of the world's carbon emissions, and they're not just going to reform themselves out of existence, and they are, because of the power, the economic power they wield, they're going to resist every tiny bit of change that we try and put in. We can't incrementally regulate it out of existence. It's interesting to me the opposition tries to tell us how urgent this is, that we don't have time for changing the system. We don't have time to dilly-dally. If that's true, why are they advocating a small, slow, liberal regulatory approach instead of the necessary thing, which is utterly and completely tearing down the fundamentally broken economic system that got us in this mess in the first place? ExxonMobil doesn't need to be regulated. ExxonMobil needs to cease to exist. We have to take assets away from those people, and if that takes a violent revolution, then I am absolutely ready, willing, and able to participate in one. Thank you.
I would like to call Constantine Georgian to oppose the motion.
Hey guys, so ladies, gentlemen, I feel like what the proposition has failed to mention throughout this whole thing, with their fixation towards renewable source of energy, is that nuclear is the best system we have. It does not require nowhere near as many rare earth minerals needed as green power. While I fail to completely remember my economical geology lectures from first year, I do believe that the biggest mine that mines these rare earth minerals is in China. And while I can't quite remember, you're going to be hearing this quite a lot throughout this debate, but I'm pretty sure there was a limit on the amount of rare earth minerals that they're willing to export. Without these rare earth minerals, we cannot get to the amount of renewable energy production that we need. Throughout physical nuclear research, the dream of thermonuclear power has always been 20 years away. Back in the 60s, it was 20 years away, now it's 20 years away. But I believe it is the only viable method of powering human society long term. In the absence of thermonuclear power, which relies on the fusion of hydrogen to helium, and then helium onwards, which produces a lot of power, I believe nuclear power, that is uranium, plutonium, whatever. Of course, there's also problems with that, such as waste being a bit bad, and turns out putting literal nuclear weapon reactors into countries that are not completely stable and completely, shall we say, conducive of our moral values is not a good idea, but nevertheless it is the best way, as nuclear power produces no emissions other than, of course, the spent fuel. I believe that socialism is not the only way to tackle it, since socialism does have a certain record with nuclear power plants,
I believe Chernobyl would not have happened to the extent that it happened in a liberal democracy, because only a totalitarian state has the power required to build a reactor that was, by the engineers, said, yeah, we're not entirely sure about how good this is, and then perform experiments on that reactor to see if it would blow up, assuming power was cut. Turns out it did blow up when power was cut. The economic system is not what we need to build nuclear reactors to solve the major problem of greenhouse emissions. And so socialism is not the only way we can solve the global climate crisis. And that's my shitty speech.
I will now put the question to the House. On the motion that this House believes that any solution to climate change must be socialist, those in favour say aye. Aye. Those against? Nay. The ayes have it. Before unlocking the doors, I will say a few words myself. The challenge that we face on climate change has been set out very well by Cian and by actually all speakers from both sides of the proposition. But the policy problem which we face of actually dealing with this is unusual. Politicians normally, when you go out and look for votes, you go out and say, I'll do this and you'll be better off. The problem about climate change is that you need to go out to the people of Ireland and say, actually, you do this, it's going to cost you, but you're not going to be better off. You're going to be worse off. It is your children or your grandchildren who are really going to suffer from the collapse of the Earth system. And that is a very difficult ask for politicians, because it is an ethical question. You are going out to people and saying, this is not necessarily going to be good for you, but it's the right thing to do. And while politicians have their code of ethics, like all of us, they're no different from us, it is not something they're comfortable with. They felt that was something you would hear in church. And I think that that is the first problem that we face in changing. I thought of putting it on an exam paper here on environmental economics, but I felt that Queen Elizabeth would have turned in her grave, the founder of this august institution. The Pope's encyclical Laudato Si', and I don't know whether you've read it, probably nobody has, but it makes a very eloquent appeal, not just to believers, to non-believers, about why it's the right thing to do to save the climate. But where the Pope really goes wrong is he doesn't believe in markets. Markets are bad. He comes from South America, where it has been part of the oppression. And one of the problems is we need to harness the market, and I think it's a point that you made, Alex, at the beginning. We need to harness the market if we are going to actually change our behaviour. Because when I was in school, if the teacher left the classroom and said, be good, maybe if he or she was gone for 10 minutes, we might be. But after 30 minutes, we'd have forgotten and there'd be a riot. And it's the same in saying to the people of Ireland, be good. Yes, it seems that actually the bulk of people want to be good, but how do you remind people? And that's where the market comes in. In terms of the policy options which we feel, and one of the things in terms of in a democracy, the competition about making life easy for people today wins out very often against improving the future of our great-grandchildren. And I think one of the major progress has been that one of the solutions is a carbon tax, that the Oireachtas Committee has got together, and not just the government, but the major part of the opposition to say, yes, we accept this. It will be painful for the people of Ireland, but it's the right way to go. And I think that it's, for me, a sign that we are changing direction, because emissions are rising all this time. Unless we take dramatic action to change now, we're going nowhere. In terms of the instrument to make this change, we need to signal to people that you've got to consume less. And how do you do it? One way is through making things more expensive. And when I go shopping at the supermarket, the price of 2 litres of milk, own brand, is $1.55. It's $1.95 if it's branded milk in the supermarket. If I have to worry about how much emissions, what the footprint has been in getting there, and there are apps which may help me to do so, I'd still be shopping. I would not be here today. You have to make it easy for people. People must understand this is the right choice. So if you reflect it in the price, and if it is also the cheap option, then they're being good to the environment. But if you don't, then it's too complicated. You need to signal. So the first reason for carbon tax is to signal to people. Markets work in terms of telling people in a simple way. It will encourage us to change, but the real reason for, or the biggest effect of the carbon tax is it sends a signal to companies who are much more responsive to profit. It says you will lose money if you produce dirty products. Why has Volkswagen invested a huge amount in electric cars? Not because they want to be good for the environment, but because they will lose out if they don't produce this. Why is there so little progress in aviation? Because there is no tax on aviation. It has got cheaper, massively cheaper over the last 20 years. It is only if it is reflected in the price that companies respond. If you hit them in the pocket, they respond, and the failure is in aviation. And the other thing about a tax compared to, say, paying for retrofits in houses is the government gets money. And it goes back to the issue of justice, which has been the proposition here, and what is fair. And the problem is, and the evidence is, that poor households spend a higher share of their budget on carbon, buying on heating and light and so on, than rich households. So that if you tax carbon, poor households will lose a bigger share of their income. So government needs money to redress that. A very extensive research has been done over 30 years in Ireland that if you're going to have a carbon tax, you must do this, otherwise the people of Ireland will reject it as being unfair. If it is not seen to be fair, it will not work. And you need to spend a third or half the revenue in compensating poor households. When you come, so the distributional effects for consumers is really important. Also, in terms of producers, it is important. Heat, thankfully, is being shut down, the peak fire generation, by the courts, by regulation, by accident. There are going to be a significant number of workers losing their jobs. They will be compensated. But the local communities will also be affected because those workers may move elsewhere or work elsewhere. If this is not seen to be handled, and it's a relatively small problem, if it is not seen to be handled a fair way, it will give climate change a bad reputation. And Europe, in particular, a really big polluter, an obstacle to Europe making major changes is Poland, because of coal. And it is compensating coal miners. We saw Mrs. Thatcher's way was one way. It did a lot for climate change in the 1980s. By shutting down the mines, but doing that is not a popular. Sorry, you're choking at me. The final thing I just want to say is, I think, yes, it was Alex who said, how can socialism deal with the problem that is cross-border? And the Pope's answer was there should be world government, but that's not going to happen. So how do you do this? Well, there are a number of ways. Why should Ethiopia, one of the poor countries in the world, spend a lot of money on cleaning up the environment? What has happened is that we, in the ineffective way we've done, we've incentivized renewable energy. So the price of that has come down. So that 3 years ago, the projections in India for coal-fired generation were for a massive expansion. Unfortunately, there has been a big expansion. much less than expected because the cost of solar power and wind has come down. So it's the cheap solution. It is the developing world. You can't say, we're the rich world, you can't have what we have. And if they're going to be able to develop, they must have clean energy, and we have the responsibility through spending our money and to incentivise research which will produce clean energy for the rest of the world. So that is one aspect in terms of the cross-border effects. And people talk about China as the laggard. China actually, there are 300 million middle-class people in China who are being polluted in their cities and being poisoned. So this is a big political issue in China. Politics works differently there. But if the government does not clean up its act environmentally, it is going to be exceptionally unpopular and destabilising. So you are seeing, it is not nearly fast enough, but you are seeing changes for the better. So in terms of the future, I'll be dead before the problem really hits. But I think it is people like me you have to address and say, remember your grandchildren. We have a long way to go. You've got to harness the market. I'm not taking sides on socialism. If the environment, Pigovian economics tells you, if somebody owns it, it will be used efficiently. There isn't a world government that owns it, and we have to live in an imperfect world and make it work and clean things up. We've got a long way to go. Thank you. To announce the Society's forthcoming events.
Hello again for the last time this evening. Firstly, I'd just like to say I think all of our speakers and our wonderful guests did a really good job this evening. I don't doubt that they deserve a second round of applause altogether. So if you join me. Couple of weeks we have a few events. So Maidens, which is a training program for new university speakers. So there's still an opportunity to sign up for that if you talk to Sophie, who is our record secretary. She runs this program. And basically we'll train you over the first term to become a better debater. If you like this debate, we have another debate next week, as we do on every Wednesday evening. The motion for next week is this House believes it is impossible to be apolitical. So in an age where young people are becoming increasingly disenfranchised with the slew of political parties that are available, we'll be examining whether or not it is possible to properly disengage from that. The last two things are your oratory returns, which I drew your attention to at the beginning of the evening. And if you could please fill those out and hand them to Maggie, who is standing at the door before you go. And finally, we have a wine and non-alcoholic drinks reception and some food upstairs before we go out. So if you'd like to join us upstairs in this conversation for wine and refreshments, please do so. So I'll hand over to the chair.
I call this house adjourned.